Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your passport to the stories that matter, globe showing Europe, Africa. I'm thrilled you're here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from around the world. Chapter 1, The Unsettling Invitation. A gentle mist clung to the lampposts along Park Lane as Hercule Poirot's taxi threaded its way through London's evening traffic. The city's bustle, clattering trams, clipped footsteps of passers-by, and the distant chime of Big Ben, felt muted, as though all of London were holding its breath in anticipation. Poirot, seated with the poise of a man who possessed not a single hair out of place, studied the thick fog through the taxi window. His keen, dark eyes reflected a mind already alight with possibilities. He tapped the armrest twice, a subtle gesture indicating readiness, and the taxi rolled smoothly to a halt before Grosvenor House. The grand facade of the Hartley residence, its portico lit by twin lanterns, presented a facade of genteel stability. Yet the servants' hurried movements and the clustering groups of anxious-faced guests betrayed a household in the grip of unease. Poirot paid them no heed. Instead, he adjusted his perfectly starched collar and buttoned his frock coat with deliberate precision. The butler, Mr. Blake, ushered him through the marble entrance hall, the hush of the mahogany-panelled walls and the faint scent of lavender and old books accompanying them. Poirot's small moustaches twitched as he noted every detail, the precise alignment of silver trays on the sideboard, the soft scuff marks on the Persian carpet, even the gleam of apprehension in Mr. Blake's otherwise impassive gaze. In the drawing-room, Lady Winifred Hartley waited amid a delicate cloud of emerald chiffon and pearls. Her composure was regal, yet her pale cheeks belied sleepless nights. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice trembling ever so slightly, "I am grateful beyond words that you have come." She moved to offer him a seat, but Poirot insisted she remain standing, insisting that the hostess should not stoop to serve her guest. As tea was poured in fine porcelain cups, Poirot's measured question drifted easily, "Madam, please recount to me, dans tous les details, the circumstances of your brother's disappearance." Lady Winifred's hands, gloved in the palest white, trembled as she lifted her cup. "My brother, Edward, retired to his study last night, as was his custom, to draw up papers for the family's shipping business. At midnight, I roused him for his evening meal, only to find the door locked from within. He did not respond to my calls. Thinking it a mere dose of fatigue, I waited a few moments, until I noticed a slip of paper on his desk, where his evening notebook should have been." She paused, swallowing. That paper, it bore the single word, regret. No signature, no explanation. And Edward, he is never so cryptic. Poirot set down his cup with exemplary care, his eyes narrowing as he studied the fine paper between Lady Winifred's gloved fingers. He traced, with the tip of his forefinger, a slight smudge upon the word, as though the ink had been wet when it was handled. "And the study itself, madam? Any sign of disturbance?" he inquired softly. Lady Winifred shook her head. "None. The heavy oak desk seems untouched, aside from that note. The windows were tightly closed, the ornate dagger letter opener lay in its usual place. Only Edward's desk drawer stood slightly ajar." She glanced toward Mr. Blake, who bowed his head. "The butler closed it for propriety's sake, monsieur. Edward, he can be forgetful." "Indeed," Poirot murmured, though his expression suggested he found the notion improbable. He rose and moved toward the study door. "If you please, I shall examine the room myself." The assembled servants parted to admit the detective, and the hush deepened. Inside Edward Hartley's study, the air was cool, scented faintly of oak and leather. Rich bookcases lined the walls, volumes on trade law and navigation stood side by side with prized leather-bound classics. The room's sole source of light came from a green-shaded banker's lamp, its glow lending a solemnity to the scene. Poirot methodically took in every facet, the angle of the chair relative to the desk, the untouched cup of cooling coffee on a side table, the soft indentation of a slipper by the carpet edge, and most peculiarly, a single fingerprint smudge on the polished surface of the brass lamp. He knelt, withdrawing a white silk handkerchief, and gently touched the lamp's surface with the corner, lifting the smudge. "Ah," he murmured, then rose. His mind, like a well-oiled machine, was cataloguing each observation. He approached the window next and allowed the sash to fall open, noting the unnaturally fresh air and the faint scent of river mud from the reservoir beyond the grounds. The windowsill bore a shallow, horizontal scratch, no more than a fingernail's width, yet sufficient to suggest someone may have forced entry or exit at an improbable hour. As Poirot straightened, Mr. Blake entered with measured steps. "Monsieur," the butler intoned, "if I might remind you that the household is gathered for dinner." He indicated Lady Winifred, whose anxious face melted into relief at Poirot's return. The detective offered a polite nod to both of them. "Dinner, OUI," he agreed. "But first, I require two things, the torn page from Monsieur Edward's ledger, and that cryptic note. We must consider these items together if justice is to be served." Back in the drawing-room, Lady Winifred presented the torn ledger page and the note. Poirot spread them on a low table, arranging them with the meticulous care of a jeweler displaying diamonds. The ledger page bore numbers, faint annotations in another hand, and a single line, underlined in red ink, reading, "Account 4052, discrepancy." Poirot tapped the margin. "Interesting, n'est-ce pas? Someone wished this page to be destroyed, or perhaps to be noticed." He turned to Lady Winifred. "Who has access to Monsieur Hartley's private papers?" Lady Winifred hesitated. "Only I, and my brother's solicitor, Mr. Carrington. And, of course, our governess, Miss Palmer, though I dare say she would never meddle in such matters." Poirot's glance drifted toward the hallway, where through the glass doors he glimpsed the poised figure of Miss Palmer, standing slightly apart from the others. Even from a distance, Poirot perceived her pale, anxious countenance, her hands clasped tightly before her. He made a mental note, between the butler's restrained tension and the governess's quiet agitation, the household harbored no shortage of secrets. He placed a kindly hand on Lady Winifred's arm. "Madam, I shall dine with you presently, but first I must speak briefly with those you have mentioned. You may be sure that I will spare no effort to ascertain the fate of your brother Edward." Lady Winifred gave a grateful nod, seated herself, and clasped the note to her breast. Poirot, adjusting his waistcoat, summoned Mr. Blake with a slight gesture. One by one, Poirot conducted his preliminary questioning, Mr. Carrington's precise recollections of Edward's schedule, Miss Palmer's insistence that she retired early, Mr. Blake's insistence that nothing unusual occurred. Yet none spoke with conviction, instead each offered variations on the theme of a locked room, a nervous sister, a missing gentleman. Poirot listened, head tilted, moustaches quivering in thought. Finally, as the church bells chimed 8 o'clock, Poirot emerged into the softly lit dining room, the household's tension palpable in their clustered seats. He took his place at the head of the table, the crystal chandelier above casting prismatic reflections across his immaculate coat. As the first course, a delicate consommé, was served, Poirot let his eyes glide slowly over each guest. There, he decided, would be the dance between truth and deceit, each course revealing another layer of motive, alibi, and suspicion. And somewhere among these gathered faces lay the key to Edward Hartley's mysterious vanishing, regret, the sole clue to penetrate the fog of lies. Thus began the investigation, poised on the edge of a blade, a missing man, a haunted family, and a detective with little grey cells prepared to pierce the heart of deception, one meticulous detail at a time. Chapter 2, A Study of Clues. The morning sun filtered through heavy drapes into Edward Hartley's study, illuminating every inch of the polished oak desk, the inlaid bookcase, and the patterned carpet. Hercule Poirot entered with deliberate calm, his small moustaches quivering with anticipation. He took a moment to inhale the room's subtle scents, leather, old paper, and a faint, almost imperceptible trace of tobacco smoke. At once, he recognized that a locked room mystery required both patience and precision. He would examine every detail, no matter how slight, for the solution lay among them. Firstly, Poirot approached the desk. Its surface was immaculate, except for the torn ledger page and the cryptic note inscribed with a single word, regret. With gloved fingers, he retrieved the note and examined it under the lamp's soft glow. The paper was fine, expensive, and bore a watermark, Bramley and Sons, London. He carefully ran his fingertip along the edge of the note, discovering a thin smear of brownish residue. Perhaps ink, or perhaps dirt, he murmured, storing this observation in his mind. He turned his attention to the ledger fragment. The figures were written in a bold, confident script, but the underlined, account 4052, discrepancy, was executed in a shakier hand, the red ink slightly smudged at the underline's end. Poirot speculated that two hands had touched, and perhaps two motives lurked behind. He placed both items on a clean sheet of blotting paper and moved to the window. Sliding open the sash, he peered out onto the lawn. The dew-damp grass glistened in the morning light. Below, the reservoir's placid water reflected the sky like a mirror. Poirot knelt to inspect the sill. There lay a slender scratch, horizontal and shallow, as though made by the careful scraping of a fingernail or the hoof of a small animal. He traced it gently with his fingertip. "This must be noted," he said, standing and wiping his finger on his handkerchief. "Did our missing gentleman leave, or did someone enter?" At the corner of the desk, Poirot noticed a silver letter opener, its blade narrow and pointed. It was not the usual dagger-shaped model but a slender heirloom, engraved with the Hartley family crest. Yet it lay at an angle that looked too deliberate, as though hastily placed after use. He lifted it with care, observing a couple of pale flecks of matter on the blade's tip. No blood, he noted, but perhaps papier de chire. He moved to a side table where a half-empty cup of tea sat on a silver saucer. The tea was cold, yet the cup bore a faint lip imprint in the foam, a woman's. Poirot sampled the rim lightly with his fingertip, noting a trace of jasmine. Curious, he thought. Monsieur Hartley preferred Earl Grey. He bagged the cup and saucer for further examination. His gaze then fell upon the chair beside the desk. Its cushion was slightly depressed, the velvet nap turned to one side. Poirot pressed gently on the cushion. Inside, under a loose seam, he felt a folded scrap of paper. Extracting it, he unfolded a tiny piece of newspaper, an item from the previous day. It bore an advertisement, Rare Orchids, Millicent and Company, High Street. On the reverse, a hurried scribble, Meet me by the glasshouse at 9. The handwriting matched neither the ledger nor the note. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A rendezvous in the greenhouse, he mused. Another player enters the drama. Satisfied that he had surveyed the major surfaces, Poirot stepped back, surveyed the room as a whole, and noted the pattern of objects, the desk at the center, the chair slightly askew, the cup and saucer on the left, the letter opener on the right. It was as though someone had paused mid-action, only to vanish. He bent to inspect the carpet. There, under the desk, was a faint smudge of mud, not quite like that found by the lake. Poirot collected a small sample on a corner of blotting paper. He straightened with a nod. We learn from the earth as much as from the letters. Encouraged by these discoveries, he summoned Mr. Blake, the butler, and requested to view the ledger itself, not merely the torn fragment. Mr. Blake produced a heavy book from a locked drawer, presenting it with formal restraint. Poirot flipped carefully through the ledger's pages until he found the entry for account 4052. There it was, a balance marked, £1, 2.50, with a neat check mark. Yet beneath it, in the same shaky red ink, appeared, subtract 1,250 equals 0. Poirot's eyebrows rose. A balancing of agreements, or perhaps the erasure of a debt, he asked. Mr. Blake could not say who had penned the red note, for only Edward and himself had keys, but neither admitted to writing it. Next, Poirot turned his attention to people rather than paper. He requested to speak with the household governess, Miss Beatrice Palmer. He found her in the conservatory, tending to her beloved orchids. The glasshouse's humid air was thick with the scent of blossoms, and water dripped from brass nozzles in a gentle rhythm. Miss Palmer started at Poirot's approach, wiping her hands on her apron like a woman hiding unwelcome news. "Miss Palmer," Poirot began, his tone courteous yet probing, "you were seen here late last night." She blushed, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. I was watering the orchids, monsieur. They are delicate creatures, they require attention even at dusk." Poirot nodded. "I understand. But I noticed the garden gate's latch remains untouched, yet you claim to have entered and exited. How did you come and go without disturbing the public path?" Miss Palmer faltered. I climbed through the side window. It sticks sometimes, but I managed." She smiled nervously. Poirot's moustaches twitched. "Sign here," he requested, offering a slip of paper and a pen. She hesitated. "Your handwriting, Miss Palmer," he explained, "will assist me in matching notes." With trembling fingers, she signed her name on the paper. Poirot examined it, his eyes quick. The cursive bore a similarity to the etchings on the orchid billet found under the desk, but the shapes differed enough to suggest a different hand. He folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. "Thank you, mademoiselle," he said. "Your assistance is invaluable." Turning his focus to the final person of interest, Poirot found Mr. Julian Ward, Edward's business partner, in the billiard room. Ward was a tall man with a hawkish nose and restless energy. He had invested heavily in the Hartley shipping line. Poirot watched him strike a ball. The man's stance was precise, but his stroke was harsh, as though force masked unease. "Mr. Ward," Poirot began, "I understand you dined early last night and left by taxi to Brighton." Ward paused, cue in hand. "That is correct," he replied, voice curt. Poirot inquired after the telegram that served as Ward's alibi. Ward produced a copy, a printed message time-stamped at 1902. "I was in Brighton at 7, he insisted. "My sister's opera performance." "Yet," Poirot pressed, "the postmark on the telegram, while dated yesterday, bears a postal date nearly 2 days hence." Ward's eyes flickered. "The postmark machine must have been slow," he muttered. Poirot smiled thinly. "Or perhaps someone wished to fabricate an alibi with a machine not set correctly." He tapped the telegram. "Machines do not abide 2 days without human oversight." Ward's composure cracked. "You insinuate I lied." Poirot's expression remained neutral. "Only that I seek the truth, monsieur. Perhaps you will explain who had access to your correspondence after you left last night." Ward bristled. "No one. I sealed it myself." Poirot let this hang in the smoky billiard-room air. "Very well. I shall consider all that you have told me." That afternoon, Poirot retired to the library to assemble his thoughts. He laid out the evidence, the ledger's red ink, the orchid advertisement, the note's watermark, the scratch on the windowsill, the mud smudge. He plotted each clue on a pad of paper, connecting them with faint lines like constellations in the night sky. His mind whirred. Someone had arranged these elements to mislead, but the true motive lay in the ledger's discrepancy. And who knew of the ledger? Edward, Lady Winifred, Mr. Blake, and Mr. Carrington. But Carrington had not yet appeared in Poirot's inquiries. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. Inspector Robinson, of Scotland Yard, stepped in, hat in hand. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I hear you have very particular methods." He produced a scrap of paper, the torn diary page from the desk, now matched by another fragment found at the Heartlands Road blackmail drop. "This scribble matches the writing on the orchid advertisement." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "So our mysterious blackmailer moves outside these walls. Yet the ink, too, matches the red in the ledger." He took the diary page and placed it beside the ledger fragment. "We have at least two people involved, one to steal Edward, another to blackmail him." Robinson's eyes widened. "You think Edward was taken for ransom?" Poirot shook his head. "No. Monsieur Hartley was taken to be silenced. The ransom is the ledger's balance. Someone wished to erase his claim. He slid both fragments into an envelope. I shall need to question Mr. Carrington promptly. If any man knows family finances, it is he." As Robinson departed, Poirot rose and smoothed his waistcoat. Outside the library window, the day drew to a close, and the shadows in Grosvenor House lengthened. A house full of people, each guarding their own secret. Yet among these layers of deception, Poirot could already sense the kernel of truth. The methodical crime, once untwined, would reveal the perpetrator. But first, he would gather all players in place, ready for the moment when every carefully laid clue would converge. And so, with little grey cells brimming with anticipation, he prepared for the next phase of his investigation, certain that the study's mysteries were merely the opening act. Chapter 3: Tensions and Alibis. The dining room at Grosvenor House was a picture of restrained elegance, silver candlesticks flickering over a polished mahogany table, fine bone china arranged with military precision, and a discreet crystal chandelier lending pale light to anxious faces. Hercule Poirot sat at the head, his posture impeccable, moustaches bristling in thought. Across from him, Lady Winifred Hartley presided over the meal with quiet dignity, though her eyes betrayed concern. Around the table sat the principal figures of the household, the reserved governess Miss Palmer, the brash business partner Julian Ward, the composed butler Mr. Blake, and the soft-spoken housekeeper Mrs. Blake. Poirot pushed back his chair with a faint click. "Miss Amis," he began, in his lilting French-accented English, "dinner may proceed, but first a few queries." Naturally, one's stomach is not closed to conversation. His tone was gentle, yet carried an unmistakable command. The servants withdrew to the antechamber, leaving behind an air that felt taut as cello strings. He addressed Mr. Ward first. "Monsieur Ward, you informed me you left Grosvenor House at 7:15 last evening, producing a telegram time-stamped at 19:02. Pray tell us, did you dispatch this message yourself, or did you entrust it to another hand?" Ward leaned forward, resting his napkin on his knee. "I sealed and handed it in myself," he replied, tapping the telegram folded in his breast pocket. "I was eager to catch the early mail. My sister's performance in Brighton depended on a personal invitation I had promised." His eyes flicked to Lady Winifred, who gave no sign of recognition. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed," Poirot said. "Yet on inspection, I noted the postmark's date did not correspond to yesterday's run. It appears to be 2 days ahead. A curious mechanical error, or something more deliberate. Machines seldom are by such an amount without human interference." Ward's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Poirot motioned to Miss Palmer. "Mademoiselle, you admitted to tending the orchids in the conservatory after dusk." The path to the glass house is cobbled and would creak beneath any footfall. Last night, however, the path gate remained silent. How did you enter and exit without detection? Miss Palmer drew in a breath. Monsieur, I climbed through the side window, she confessed. The latch is balky, but I managed. Her voice quivered. At her place lay a folded note addressed, to be read in privacy, which Poirot's discreet glance caught as her hand shook over the tablecloth. He noted the paper's texture, a match to the regret note, and stored this in his memory. He turned to Mrs. Blake, whose demure composure was strained. Madam, you have served this house faithfully for many years. Yet last night, you passed a visitor in the hall whose footsteps were neither Mr. Blake's nor the footman's. Might you recall whose they were? Mrs. Blake's eyes filled with tears. She dabbed at her handkerchief. I thought it was Edward returning, monsieur. But the footsteps stopped outside the study and then faded. Her distress seemed genuine, yet Poirot's little grey cells ticked. Why would the housekeeper cry for one she believed safely home? Was it sorrow for Edward, or fear for someone else? The courses moved on: consommé, salmon en croûte, asparagus with muslin sauce, and Poirot savoured the flavours as a means of distraction, though his mind raced. Between mouthfuls, he cast discreet glances at the guests. Lady Winifred's lips were drawn tight, Ward's restless fingers tapped the table, Miss Palmer's gaze flickered toward the drawing-room door, Mr. Blake's posture remained immovable, yet his eyes betrayed alertness. Each gesture, minute in itself, contributed to a larger tapestry of unease. Halfway through the main course, Poirot summoned the house ledger from Mr. Blake under polite request. He leafed through its pages and deftly extracted the torn ledger fragment, placing it alongside the regret note. He then slid both toward Mrs. Blake. Madam, these items were found in Edward's study. Do you recognize the handwriting? Mrs. Blake's tears paused as she leaned closer, whispering, No, monsieur, I have never seen such script. Poirot nodded and placed a finger on the underlined word, discrepancy, in red ink. Who, then, may have cause to conceal a financial imbalance in the family's accounts? He fixed his gaze on Lord Hartley's solicitor, Mr. Carrington, whose invitation to dinner had been postponed by urgent business and who, notably, sat absent. Poirot's expression was serene but his eyes were keen. At that moment, the library door opened and Mr. Carrington entered, slightly breathless, taking the seat Lady Winifred indicated. His calm, scholarly air contrasted with the tension around him. Poirot greeted him warmly. Monsieur, your valuable presence completes our circle. Pray, you are well. Carrington inclined his head. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Business detained me, regrettably. He smiled thinly, glancing at the ledger entries Poirot had spread out. I see we have been discussing Edward's accounts. A most delicate matter. Delicate indeed, Poirot agreed, folding his napkin. Would you care to explain who might profit from a misbalance in account 4052? Carrington's composure held, but his pencil-thin lips pressed together before he answered. Certainly not I. I only manage the estate's finances faithfully. Poirot's eyes narrowed fractionally. Yet the red underlining in the ledger, the torn fragment, it implies someone wished to highlight, and erase, a debt. He tapped the ledger. Carrington's gaze flickered to Miss Palmer, then to Mrs. Blake, as though he tested them for a hidden reaction. Poirot noted this. We shall explore this further. As the souffle arrived, Poirot stood. Dinner is a time for nourishment, but also for truth. I propose a brief intermission. He invited the household to retire to the drawing room, where coffee and liqueurs awaited. We shall continue our discourse there. Rising, he paused by the sideboard and retrieved an envelope concealed beneath the plates. With a delicate movement, he tucked it into his waistcoat pocket. In the drawing-room's soft lamplight, guests settled into chairs. Poirot offered each a small glass of curaçao. "A digestive to aid reflection," he said. He then announced, "Let us rehearse our movements from the night in question. I ask each person, in turn, to recount precisely where they were between 9:30 and midnight." He turned to Mr. Blake. The butler spoke of escorting servants off duty and retiring to his quarters, although he omitted whether anyone had passed through the servants' hall. Poirot made a mental note. Next, Mrs. Blake described locking the kitchen doors at 10:30, hearing footsteps in the corridor, and then going to bed. Miss Palmer was next. She claimed the greenhouse until 11, then her room to read by candlelight. "But a candle does not light a corridor," Poirot observed. "Did you not need to traverse the hall?" She hesitated, admitting briefly entering the drawing-room to fetch a shawl. Poirot filed this. Ward followed, stating he dined early in town and returned at 11:30, but offered no sighting of the household. Lady Winifred, finally, said she awaited Edward's appearance for supper, then retired to pray, a curious choice of time for devotion, Poirot thought. When it came to Mr. Carrington, his alibi was impeccable, drafting urgent legal briefs in his study until midnight. Yet Poirot noticed Carrington's fingers tremble as he put down his glass, an involuntary sign betraying stress. With everyone's account recorded, Poirot tapped his glass lightly. "Thank you, Miss Amis. You have been most forthcoming. Now, allow me a brief moment to reflect." He rose and walked to the window, peering out into the grounds. Under the moonlight, the distant reservoir was an inky mirror. Glancing back, he allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. Many alibis. Many statements. Yet among these well-rehearsed acts, one small gesture, one misplaced word, may reveal the truth. We must remain vigilant. The assembled guests exchanged uneasy glances. Poirot turned, his gaze sweeping the room, and concluded, "We will pause our inquiries until tomorrow. Tonight, sleep well, for tomorrow, the investigation deepens." With that, he bowed and left the room, his dark silhouette framed by the lamplight. As the household dispersed, whispers filled the corridors. Who among them lied? Whose alibi fractured beneath scrutiny? And what motive lay hidden behind the stolen hours of a man named Edward Hartley? With every step, Poirot's mind catalogued a new question, for in the silent theatre of Grosvenor House, the dance of deception had only just begun. Chapter 4, A Secret Revealed. The morning air in the conservatory was thick with humidity and the sweet perfume of orchids when Hercule Poirot arrived to see Miss Beatrice Palmer. The glass panes overhead reflected the grey autumn sky, and water droplets clung to the lush leaves, refracting light like tiny prisms. Miss Palmer stood beside a row of rare white cymbidiums, her slim fingers brushing lovingly over their petals. At the sound of Poirot's footfall on the gravel, she turned, her face pale but determined. "Monsieur Poirot," she greeted softly, folding her hands in front of her. "Thank you for seeing me again so early." "Madam," Poirot replied in his customary gentle tone, "we have shared many words already, but the little grey cells demand more. Will you confide in me, without fear of reproach, what Monsieur Edward Hartley revealed to you in confidence?" Miss Palmer's eyes filled with hesitation. She glanced at the orchids for a moment, as though drawing strength from their fragile beauty, before she spoke. "Monsieur," she began, voice trembling, "I could not bear silence any longer. Edward, he trusted me more than anyone else in the house. When he grew troubled by anonymous letters, I was the only one he would tell. Only I knew how frightened he was." Poirot inclined his head, waiting. Miss Palmer drew a folded piece of paper from the pocket of her apron and offered it to him. He gave me this diary entry last night, and bade me keep it hidden from all. Poirot accepted the paper with consummate care. The entry, written in Edward's neat script, read: I fear the spectre of my father's disgrace haunts the Hartley name. A correspondent demands the return of family letters, once thought lost, or I shall see my inheritance evaporate before I draw breath. As you see, monsieur, Miss Palmer continued, Edward spoke of blackmail. He believed someone possessed letters written years ago by his late father, matters of scandal, he said, too shameful for the family to bear. Poirot smoothed the page and studied it under a drop of diffused light. The words are Edward's, no question. But this diary entry indicates motive. Someone has threatened to expose the elder Hartley's secret unless Edward surrendered the capital due to him. Who among us has knowledge of those letters' existence? He glanced thoughtfully at Miss Palmer. And why were these letters never destroyed or buried with discretion? Miss Palmer's face crumpled with anxiety. I do not know, monsieur. Edward said they were entrusted to our solicitor, Mr. Carrington, after our father's death. But he claimed Carrington had assured him they were lost, until the correspondence surfaced. Interesting, Poirot murmured. Thus the blackmailer knows of the letter's location, or at least their custodianship. Yet the blackmailer also knows of Edward's vulnerability regarding the inheritance, evidenced by the forged ledger entry. Two operations, perhaps two perpetrators, one to vanish Edward, another to extort him. He folded the diary page and returned it to her. You are sure of your father's honesty, Miss Palmer? She nodded vigorously. My family, Monsieur Hartley, trusts me utterly. He would never deceive me. Nor inform any other witness, I imagine. Poirot's moustaches twitched. You, mademoiselle, hold at least two secrets, this diary entry, and your evening sojourn in the glasshouse, details you withheld until now. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Tell me everything you have not yet told. Miss Palmer took a breath and recounted her story, how Edward, distressed by a series of anonymous letters, had sought refuge among the orchids, how he had placed this diary entry within the folds of her gown for safekeeping, how she had retreated here to think, intending to hand the page to Lady Winifred at dawn, but instead had been summoned to the drawing-room for questioning. Poirot listened, absorbing each nuance, the precise hour of their conversation, the tone in Edward's voice, the trembling in her hands. When she finished, Poirot selected a dropped wisp of orchid pollen from the ground and examined it through his monocle. These orchids, he said, are imported from the Dutch East Indies. Rare, expensive, and cared for by few. You spent an hour here last night. Yet the pollen on your gown is that of a hybrid, acclimatized in Mrs. Blake's private greenhouse, not here. Miss Palmer's eyes widened. It is so, she admitted, voice small. I went to Mrs. Blake's greenhouse as well, after our conversation. I needed to clear my mind. Her gaze flicked to Poirot. I did not think it important. But it is, Poirot replied. Two locations visited, two sets of footprints that may have been observed. Worth noting for the police. And furthermore, he tapped the diary entry, the handwriting is identical to that on the orchid advertisement and to the pencil scrawl on the ledger fragment, save for Edward's signature. Miss Palmer's brow furrowed. You mean? Someone forged Edward's hand, Poirot said. We already know of the torn advertisement, a clandestine meeting in the glasshouse. But the same hand has penned the red underline in the ledger, and the blackmail note that concealed Edward. This hand belongs to someone with intimate knowledge of the household's routines and personal proclivities. Miss Palmer sank onto a wicker chair. But who? Poirot regarded her with kind intensity. Think, mademoiselle. Who among the Hartley circle is close enough to possess your handwriting sample, to enter private spaces unobserved, and to know of the father's letters? Who has motive both to steal Edward and to profit from his disappearance? Miss Palmer closed her eyes. Mr. Carrington, she whispered. He is the only one with unfettered access to every room. He visits Edward's study at all hours under the guise of professional duty. She hesitated. And he admired Lady Winifred's family jewels the other day. He spoke of their value with too much interest. Poirot's brow creased in thought. Ah, interest indeed. But interest of the wallet, or interest of the heart? He rose and offered her a handkerchief. Thank you, mademoiselle, for your courage in revealing this. You have provided the key to understanding the sequence. Now, I must verify your story with one more visit to Mrs. Blake. Miss Palmer rose, wiping anxious tears. I fear I have implicated myself. Not at all, Poirot said with reassurance. Your honesty is a beacon in this affair. Trust in my discretion. He stepped into the gravel path outside, where a fresh breeze had dispelled the morning mist. The path led toward the kitchen wing, where Mrs. Blake's greenhouse lay concealed by yew hedges. Poirot paused, inhaling the sharper scent of earth and perspiration, as though the very soil belonged to secrets waiting to be unearthed. He tucked the orchid billet and diary page into his pocket and set off, confident that the moment of revelation drew near. In the hush before midday, Poirot felt the thrill of pursuit quicken his heart. The blackmailer's mask had slipped, the wheel of suspicion now turned steadily toward Mr. Carrington. Yet Poirot knew better than to leap to conclusions. There were still shadows to trace, grudges to uncover, and subtle lies to untangle. By day's end, he vowed, the true architect of Edward Hartley's disappearance would stand exposed under the bright light of justice, just as the glasshouse's orchids would bloom in clarity once winter's fog had lifted. Chapter 5, The False Trail. Late that morning, Hercule Poirot convened Inspector Robinson in the oak-panelled library of Grosvenor House. The detective's keen eyes flicked to a small, battered watch resting on a silver tray. This was found by the reservoir, Inspector Robinson reported, removing his gloves. A boy fishing at dawn discovered it among the reeds. Remarkably, it still ticks. Poirot lifted the watch, its silver case engraved with the initials EH and a family crest nearly worn away. He held it close to his ear, listening to the steady tick-tock. Notice, mon ami, the winding crown is fully drawn out, indicating it was stopped deliberately, then restarted only recently. He set it aside gently. Also, Robinson continued, we found a man's leather shoe near the water's edge. The sole shows traces of mud from the estate grounds, not the reservoir bank. A subtle discrepancy, Poirot murmured, for the mud by the lake is pebbly, this imprint is a soft loam, likely from the greenhouse path. Someone seeks to mislead us. He tapped his temple. We shall follow this false trail, but with caution. That evening, Poirot gathered the household in the drawing-room once more. The fire cast dancing shadows over anxious faces as Lady Winifred, Miss Palmer, Julian Ward, Mr. Carrington, Mr. Blake, and Mrs. Blake took their seats. Poirot stood beside a small table upon which lay the recovered watch, the shoe, and the torn orchid advertisement. Miss Amis, Poirot began, his voice calm yet resonant, the body of Edward Hartley, I regret to inform you, has likely met its end in the reservoir. A collective gasp rose. Poirot allowed the silence to deepen. The watch found there, inscribed with his initials and still ticking, confirms his presence at that spot. Furthermore, the shoe matched those Mr. Hartley was wearing last night. He allowed these statements to sink in, noting every subtle reaction. Miss Palmer clutched her shawl, white-knuckled. Miss Blake's composure cracked, and tears welled in her eyes. Monsieur Ward's jaw tightened, and Mr. Carrington's hand trembled as he raised a glass of sherry to his lips. Poirot quietly observed each in turn, filing away every quiver and quickened breath. And yet, Poirot continued after a measured pause, the evidence is not as straightforward as it appears. The mud on the shoe is not from the reservoir bank but from the greenhouse path. The watch was restarted, its crown left open, only within the last 12 hours. He pointed to the torn orchid advertisement. This advertisement arranged for a meeting in the greenhouse at 9, an appointment never fulfilled, save to plant these misleading clues. Lady Winifred's face blanched. Miss Palmer stared at the floor, as though stricken. Mr. Carrington released a shaky exhale. Poirot leaned forward, voice dropping to a quiet intensity. Someone wishes us to believe Edward is drowned, thereby silencing inquiries permanently. Yet I propose that Edward is very much alive, hidden, perhaps even nearby. And the true perpetrator moves among us this very moment. A tremor passed through the group. Mrs. Blake rose abruptly. Monsieur Poirot, is Edward really alive? Her tears flowed freely. Oh, dear Edward. She sank back into her chair, sobbing openly. Poirot's compassionate gaze met hers for a heartbeat, then shifted to Mr. Carrington. Carrington's face had gone ashen. He stammered, I cannot believe this, his voice broke. Ward cleared his throat, leaning forward. If Edward lives, we must find him, he declared. Poirot nodded. Precisely. We shall search the estate at first light. But before we proceed, I must examine the exact composition of the mud on that shoe. He summoned Mr. Blake and Mrs. Blake to escort him back to the greenhouse. Under the conservatory's glass roof, Poirot knelt beside a bed of orchids, while Mrs. Blake and Mr. Blake stood by respectfully. He compared the mud from the shoe to that beneath the greenhouse paths, then to that he had previously sampled from the reservoir bank. Observe, he said, pressing a sample between his gloved fingers. The particles matched the greenhouse earth. The blackmailer, nay, the orchestrator, planted both watch and shoe here, then carried them to the reservoir to stage Edward's death scene. Why the extra effort? To divert suspicion from someone with intimate knowledge of both locations. Mrs. Blake shook her head, distraught. Poirot rose, brushing imaginary dust from his coat. Miss Palmer informed me of her nocturnal visits here, to water the orchids. Yet none but Mrs. Blake holds the key to this place. He turned to the housekeeper. Madam, you and your husband knew of this greenhouse path and its soil. You alone could lift a shoe from here without detection. Mrs. Blake's face crumpled, she buried her face in her hands. I did not want him to die, she sobbed. I only meant to frighten him. Poirot raised a calming hand. Madam, I understand more from your tears than you suspect. But fear not, I shall shield you from undue blame, provided you tell me everything. Through her tears, Mrs. Blake confessed, Edward had discovered discrepancies in the family accounts, specifically that account 4052 was falsified to hide embezzlement. She revealed that Carrington, entrusted with the finances, had instructed her to misdirect Edward into the greenhouse, then stage an accident by the lake. He had promised her a share of the estate's balance if she cooperated. The watch and shoe were meant to cement the illusion of drowning. Poirot listened intently, nodding. Once she finished, he thanked the Blakes and requested her to retire early. Mrs. Blake's shoulders slumped as she left. Back in the drawing room, Poirot reassembled the household. The firelight glinted off his immaculate coat as he addressed them all. Miss Amis, he began gravely, we now understand that Edward Hartley's disappearance is not a simple matter of blackmail, but a cover-up of financial betrayal. The staging of his death was intended to halt his inquiries into account 4052's discrepancy, thereby preserving the embezzler's secret. He paused, letting the weight of his words resonate. He turned to the anxious figure of Mr. Carrington. "Sir, you occupy a unique position of trust, solicitor, guardian of family finances, custodian of the late Mr. Hartley's letters. You leveraged this trust to forge red herrings, misleading telegrams, a planted advertisement, and this deceptive watch and shoe." Poirot produced the orchid advertisement and placed it before Carrington. "Your handwriting appears here, and in the red underlining of the ledger fragment. You knew the schedule of greenhouse visits, the source of this mud, and the location of Edward's study." Carrington's defiance crumbled. "It was not meant to go this far," he whispered. "I only wanted to save the Hartley fortune, and myself, from ruin." Poirot inclined his head. "And when Edward discovered the embezzlement, you sought to silence him permanently. You enlisted Mrs. Blake's aid, promising her reward. Yet you underestimated the power of the little grey cells, and the compassion of Monsieur and Madame Blake." He turned to Lady Winifred. "Madam, you may wish to take legal counsel, but I advise mercy for the housekeeper. She acted under duress." Lady Winifred nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. I shall consider your counsel." Finally, Poirot addressed the group at large. "Edward is safe, hidden in a cottage on the estate's edge, recovering from shock. At dawn, we shall liberate him and confront the truth openly." He offered a faint smile. "Thus, the false trail is exposed, and the house may sleep in peace once more." As the household absorbed this revelation, a sense of relief and astonishment fell upon Grosvenor House. Outside, the autumn wind rustled the trees, as though echoing Poirot's final thought, "In every carefully constructed deception, a single loose thread will unravel the entire tapestry, and only a mind as meticulous as his could discover it." Chapter 6, Unraveling Psyches. Late in the afternoon, the drawing-room of Grosvenor House was suffused with a hush born of recent revelations. Poirot sat beneath the portrait of Lord Hartley, whose stern gaze seemed to overlook the gathering below. The detective's little grey cells were far from silent, they churned as he prepared to explore the inner workings of each mind in his orbit. He had exposed the false trail, uncovered the planted watch and shoe, and confirmed that Edward was alive and hidden. Now, he would probe more deeply, not merely the facts, but the fears, hopes, and secrets that animated every heart in the house. He rose and smoothed his coat. "Miss Amis," he announced in a measured tone, "we have confronted deceptions of the hand. Let us now turn to deceptions of the mind and heart. One may know what a person has done, but to understand why they did it, one must delve into the soul." He invited each principal figure to join him in turn for a brief interview, privately, and in sequence. 1. Julian Ward. Poirot found Mr. Ward in the billiard room, polishing a cue as though it were a conductor's baton. The room was dim, save for a shaft of light falling across the emerald baize. Ward's features were drawn, his eyes restless. "Monsieur Ward," Poirot began, "you invested heavily in the Hartley shipping line. Edward's disappearance threatened your fortunes as much as it did Lady Winifred's." He seated himself opposite Ward. "Tell me, sir, did you ever fear that Edward's inquiries into the family accounts might reveal errors that could cost you dearly?" Ward hesitated, tapping the cue against the table. "I feared only for the business, monsieur. If Edward had discovered malfeasance, whether my own or another's, the company could have collapsed." He pressed his lips together. "I had hoped to buy more time, to persuade him to postpone his audit." His voice wavered. "I would never have wished him harm." Poirot nodded slowly. Fear for one's livelihood is a powerful motivator. Yet you also stood to gain from Edward's absence. As eldest male partner, you would assume sole control. Ward's eyes met Poirot's. Control, he echoed, yes, but not at the price of my friend's life. Poirot studied him. Very well. Fear and opportunity are present, but not the will. Monsieur Ward. He rose, leaving Ward to his cue and his thoughts. 2. Miss Beatrice Palmer. In the glasshouse, Miss Palmer hovered over her orchids, small hands clenched. The tropical heat wrapped around them like a shawl. At Poirot's entrance, she straightened abruptly. Mademoiselle, you shield Edward's secrets as if they were your own, Poirot began kindly. You admitted to hiding his diary entry, yet you withheld that knowledge from Lady Winifred. Why? Miss Palmer's throat tightened. I feared Lady Winifred's reaction. The scandalous letters, if revealed, would shatter her faith in the Hartley name. I acted to protect her feelings. She brushed a droplet of condensation from a leaf. I never wished to conceal evidence from Monsieur Poirot. Only from my lady. And the orchids? Poirot gestured to the blossoms. You went to Mrs. Blake's greenhouse after midnight. Was it to escape anxiety, or to pass a message unseen? Miss Palmer's cheeks flushed. To think. I needed air, space away from the house. I did not plan to meet anyone. She looked down. But I admit I feared being watched. Poirot offered a gentle smile. Fear is a telling emotion. You protect those you love, yet in doing so, you risk obstructing justice. Merci, mademoiselle. He patted her hand before departing. 3. Mrs. Blake. Mrs. Blake awaited Poirot in her greenhouse, the low glass roof gleaming above rows of geraniums. Her face was drawn, divorce between duty and guilt lingered in her eyes. Madam, Poirot began softly, you confessed to helping stage Edward's drowning. Yet you wept as though you believed him gone. Explain. Mrs. Blake trembled. Monsieur, I was frightened. Mr. Carrington threatened to ruin me should I refuse. He promised I would lose my position, perhaps even be arrested for misdeeds in the house. She pressed her hand to her breast. I loved Edward as I would my own son. Tears fell. When I saw him carried away, I believed I had killed him. Poirot nodded, eyes sympathetic. You acted under duress, mired between loyalty and self-preservation. Yet you have a good heart. Your remorse speaks true. He laid a reassuring hand on her arm. Merci, Madame Blake. 4. Mr. Blake. The butler, Mr. Blake, remained in the servants' hall, polishing silver trays. Poirot watched him for a moment before speaking. Monsieur Blake, you observed every footstep in this house, every whispered conversation. Poirot regarded him kindly. You suspected wrongdoing, yet did you suspect Mr. Carrington? Blake paused, his reflection wavering in the polished surface. He set down the tray. I saw the solicitor visiting Edward's study at odd hours. But I could not presume malice, my duty bound me to respect privacy. He lowered his gaze. I feared the overthrow of the household's peace more than deceit. Poirot's moustaches twitched. Duty can blind us, even when truth lies in plain sight. You will not be blamed for withholding suspicion. He patted Blake's shoulder. Merci, monsieur. 5. Mr. Julian Carrington. Finally, Mr. Carrington awaited Poirot in the library, seated before the very ledger that had ignited this odyssey. His hands trembled as he smoothed the page. Monsieur Carrington, Poirot began, tone gentle but firm, you were entrusted with the family's finances and their most intimate papers. Edward discovered a discrepancy in account 4052 and demanded answers. Carrington's eyes flickered to the ledger. He did. He was insistent. And you, Poirot leaned forward, you forged entries to mask embezzlement. You planted clues to stage his demise, thinking that fear of the reservoir's depths would silence him forever. Carrington paled. I only took what was owed to me for my years of service. The Hartley fortune, without proper recompense, I believed I deserved it. Poirot inclined his head. Greed and resentment are potent forces. Yet you misjudged the tenacity of truth. You enlisted others, manipulated dear Mrs. Blake, and almost destroyed an innocent man. He folded his hands. Tell me, Monsieur Carrington, did you ever consider that love of money was not stronger than Edward's desire for justice? Carrington's shoulders sagged. I thought my position would protect me. I was wrong. He raised a trembling hand. I am sorry. Poirot surveyed him calmly. Monsieur. Your confession frees us to restore balance. As dusk gathered, Poirot returned to the drawing room, where each suspect awaited the outcome of their interview. He stood before Lady Winifred, who sat at the piano, fingers resting upon the keys as though about to play. Madam, he said, we have unwrapped each soul, and revealed motives of fear, loyalty, ambition, and greed. The external clues, the watch, the shoe, the notes, were but surface ripples. Beneath, the currents of human desire drove the crime. Lady Winifred closed her eyes, pressing her palms to the keys. My brother's safety, my family's honor, the fate of the staff, each weighed upon me like a stone. She opened her eyes, meeting Poirot's. What remains? Poirot allowed a small smile. Now, madam, we set our trap. Tomorrow, at afternoon tea, we shall convene all present to draw out the final confession. He straightened. For a crime born of the heart, it is best resolved in the open, where every heart may lighten, and every sin be laid bare. With that, Poirot withdrew to his chamber to prepare the precise arrangements. Outside, the night wind rustled the trees, as though heralding the final act of a drama that had ensnared every soul at Grosvenor House. And in the quiet dark, Poirot's mind raced, weaving together the threads of motive and opportunity, until the tapestry of truth awaited only the final, decisive stroke. Chapter 7, The Trap is Set. Late the following morning, Hercule Poirot convened the principal members of Grosvenor House in the drawing-room once more. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, illuminating the Persian rug in a patchwork of gold and amber. A small table stood at the center, upon which lay a decanter of amber-toned cognac and 6 fresh slips of ivory paper alongside fine fountain pens. Poirot, standing before them in his impeccable frock coat, regarded each face in turn, Lady Winifred, poised but anxious, Miss Palmer, slender figure tense, Julian Ward, restless, Mr. Blake, inscrutable, Mrs. Blake, wrung with remorse, and, arriving last, the solicitor, Mr. Carrington, who masked uncertainty behind a courteous bow. Miss Amis, Poirot began, his voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable edge of purpose, we have already exposed the contrivances used to abduct Monsieur Edward. We know the how, staged clues, blackmail, and deceitful manipulation of the family accounts. Today, we shall unmask the who, once and for all. I ask each of you to write, in your own hand, a brief message to Edward Hartley, whom I am pleased to announce will return this afternoon at tea. He smiled, though his eyes glittered. Let your words be genuine, we proceed without subterfuge. One by one, the assembled guests sat at the table. Poirot stood slightly behind each to observe their writing. Lady Winifred paused before composing a gentle note of reassurance. Miss Palmer's slip betrayed her relief, her delicate script curling in exuberance. Julian Ward's bold characters hinted at impatience. Mr. Blake's neat block letters communicated formality more than emotion. Mrs. Blake's shaky hand revealed profound guilt and hope that Edward might forgive her. Finally, Carrington approached the table. He lifted the pen, hesitated, then wrote swiftly, his script strikingly similar to the red ink that had underlined the ledger fragment and scrawled the orchid advertisement. Poirot watched Carrington intently. When the solicitor had finished, Poirot took each note in turn, examined the handwriting beneath a lens, and placed them face down in a neat pile. "Excellent," he murmured, tapping the stack. "We shall now seal these messages in envelopes and leave them here." He directed the housekeeper to distribute the 6 envelopes to their respective authors, then dismissed them momentarily to the far side of the room. As the guests shifted, Poirot moved to the table, slipped an envelope between the others, and extracted a single sheet from his breast pocket, an unsigned note reading, "Regret." He folded it into an envelope of matching stock and laid it atop the pile. Returning to the assembled party, he announced, "I have prepared one final message from Edward, to be shared with his beloved household. We await his arrival at 3:30. Until then, I invite you to partake in a selection of Petit's fours in the conservatory while refreshments are made ready here." Without protest, the group filtered out, exchanging anxious glances. Miss Palmer lingered by Lady Winifred, whispering a hopeful, "Perhaps he has returned already." Ward and Mr. Blake fell into restrained conversation near the fireplace. Mrs. Blake trembled as she carried her envelope toward the door, while Carrington remained by the table, his eyes fixed on the cognac. Once the drawing room was clear, Poirot approached Carrington quietly. "Monsieur," he said, tone affable, "you will not object to my examining your note?" Carrington's voice caught. I see no reason why." Poirot took the envelope, slipped out the paper, and held it before Carrington's eyes. The penmanship matched precisely the forged words Poirot had previously attributed to the blackmailer. Carrington's cheeks went pale. "Your signature confirms this same hand penned the threatening letters, the ledger's alibi forgery, and this message from Edward," Poirot stated. "In the letter G of regret, the loop at the tail is identical. The slight incline, the pressure points, they are unmistakable." Carrington's mouth opened, then closed. "Monsieur, I can explain," he began, but Poirot raised a gloved finger. "Explain at tea, monsieur. For now, I require your presence." Poirot slid the forged note back into its envelope and replaced it in the stack. "We must preserve the integrity of the demonstration." A footman announced that tea was ready. The guests re-entered, guided to the arranged seats. The table was set with fine china, silver tongs held sugary cakes, and a delicate rosewood tray bore 6 sealed envelopes. Edward's seat at the head of the table was marked by an empty armchair, a folded napkin draped over its back. Lady Winifred sank into her place with quivering dignity, whispering, "I trust my brother is well." Miss Palmer's gaze remained fixed on the door. Poirot signalled the butler. "Please," he said softly, "would Monsieur Edward Hartley step forward?" The door opened, admitting Inspector Robinson flanked by a lieutenant. Behind them was Edward himself, tall, pallid, but resolute, clad in a simple dark suit, bearing no trace of the earlier terror. He crossed to his seat as gasps rippled through the group. Lady Winifred sprang from hers, rushing to embrace her brother. Miss Palmer followed, pressing to his side with tears of relief. Ward offered a solemn nod, while Mr. and Mrs. Blake overcame themselves to smile through tears. Carrington remained seated, face ashen, hands clenched. Poirot cleared his throat. "Welcome, Monsieur Hartley. You have endured much, but now we celebrate your safe return." He gestured to the table. "Before you speak, I propose a symbolic gesture. Each person shall place their message to you here at your place." He opened the envelopes one by one, placing each note beside Edward's plate. Finally, he placed the 8th envelope, his own forged note, last of all. Edward surveyed the assortment of missives with a solemn brow. He retrieved the top envelope, the one from Carrington. His eyes flicked to the handwriting, and his expression sharpened. He opened it and read, "My dear Edward, I regret the unfortunate necessity of your departure. I look forward to your swift return, H.W." He raised his gaze. "H.W., he said quietly. "Julian Ward?" he asked, turning to Ward. Ward's face drained of color. "My initials, dear Edward." Ward stammered, I, but Edward shook his head. Poirot interjected, "Not Ward, nonplus. Observe, the verso of the envelope bears traces of the same red ink used in the ledger underlining and in the blackmail advertisement. Monsieur Carrington, would you care to explain why your note bears such ink?" Carrington's composure shattered. He stood, voice trembling. I did it to confirm your presence, to manage the blackmail's timing." His protest was dashed by Poirot's steady gaze. Edward laid the letters aside. "I know now who orchestrated my disappearance, who falsified accounts, and who sought to profit from my ruin." He pointed to Carrington. "It was you, Julian Carrington, who betrayed the Hartley name." Carrington sank back into his chair, hollowed by guilt. Poirot closed the final chapter. The little grey cells have triumphed. By this orchestrated return and by revealing the blackmailer's own handwriting, we have compelled confession. He nodded to Inspector Robinson, who rose to place Carrington under formal arrest. As Carrington was led away, Edward turned to his housekeeper. "Madam, you may remain in my service," he said warmly to Mrs. Blake. "Your loyalty, though misled, was never toward wrongdoing." Mrs. Blake bowed, tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. At last, Poirot allowed himself a small smile. "Miss Amis, justice has been served not merely by evidence, but by understanding the hearts behind the crime. May this house know peace once more." The afternoon sun, pouring through the windows, seemed to applaud his words, casting Grosvenor House in a glow of hard-won truth and reconciliation. Chapter 8. The Revelation. The drawing-room at Grosvenor House was bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight as Hercule Poirot stood before the assembled household. Lady Winifred Hartley sat beside her brother Edward, whose recovery was now assured, yet whose spirit remained subdued by recent ordeals. Miss Palmer remained close at hand, her eyes bright with relief. Julian Ward, Mr. and Mrs. Blake, and a contingent of Scotland Yard officers looked on, tense with anticipation. Poirot's impeccable demeanour was unchanged, his moustaches quivering ever so slightly with satisfaction. "Miss Amis," he began, his voice warm but authoritative, "we have arrived at the final act of our drama. Everything, the smallest clue and the grandest gesture, now assembles before us to reveal the truth." He indicated a small table where the key items were displayed, the torn ledger page, the regret note, the silver watch, the leather shoe, and the orchid advertisement. Poirot picked up the torn ledger fragment, holding it aloft. "First, allow me to summarize the financial intrigue that set this tragedy in motion. Account 4052 showed a discrepancy of £1,250, some quite considerable. The underlining in red ink was forged, intended to trick Edward into believing he had no rightful claim to his inheritance. Who, then, stood to benefit most from erasing Edward's share? Not his business partner, Mr. Ward, he said, casting Ward a courteous look, for Julian's interest was in the prosperity of the shipping line, not personal profit. Rather, the person with exclusive control of the family accounts, and sole access to these papers, was the solicitor, Mr. Carrington. A murmur ran through the room. Carrington's composed facade flickered. Poirot continued, Carrington stood entrusted with Hartley finances and the preservation of family honor. When Edward demanded explanation, Carrington faced ruin, not only of reputation but of potential livelihood. Thus he sought to divert Edward's inquiries by every means, blackmail rumors concerning Lord Hartley's lost letters, forged telegrams, and the planting of false clues. He held up the Regretful Note. This terse message was intended to mask the orchestrator's identity. Its paper and ink matched the orchid advertisement and the forged ledger. The loops on the letter G and the stroke of the T betray a single hand. A hand that, you see, belongs to Mr. Carrington. Carrington's color drained as Poirot placed the note back on the table. Next, the staged drowning. Poirot held the silver watch. My friend Inspector Robinson and I discovered this watch at the reservoir. Its winding crown was drawn out, stopped deliberately, and then restarted recently so that the victim's presence at the water's edge could be falsified. The watch's initials were used to suggest Edward's demise. He turned to Mrs. Blake. And the shoe, madam? Mrs. Blake, still pale with contrition, replied, I brought the shoe and watch to the reservoir at Mr. Carrington's behest. He told me it would appear that that Monsieur Edward, had died, and that all inquiries would cease. She covered her face, weeping softly. Poirot nodded gently. Under duress, you complied. Yet you were misled, and so you erred with a guilty heart. You believed yourself protecting the household's interest, but you were ensnared by a false covenant. He paused, allowing compassion to soften his words. Your cooperation now aids justice, and your honesty shall be remembered kindly by Edward. He addressed the group again. We must also acknowledge red herrings, Miss Palmer's nocturnal visits to the glasshouse, intended only for emotional solace, yet exploited to suggest clandestine meetings, Mr. Ward's telegram, a genuine invitation marred by a postmark error, and the locked room illusion, alleviated by a simple scratch on the windowsill, where our culprit entered and left undetected. Poirot placed his hands behind his back. And what of Edward himself? When removed from his study, he was hidden in a cottage on the estate's edge, under the watchful care of the inspector. His knowledge of the family's affairs represented a threat Carrington could not countenance. Edward drew a deep breath and met his brother's eyes, finding strength in Lady Winifred's proud smile. Poirot stepped forward. Monsieur Carrington, by your own admission you embezzled from the Hartley accounts and orchestrated a disappearance to conceal it. You forged notes, manipulated others, and nearly destroyed an innocent man. In short, you betrayed every tenet of your profession. He signaled to Inspector Robinson, who rose to place Carrington under formal arrest. As Carrington was gently but firmly led away, Poirot turned to Edward. Monsieur, justice has run its course. You may now reclaim your rightful inheritance, and with it, peace of mind. Edward nodded, voice steady but soft. I owe my life to Monsieur Poirot's insight and to the courage of those who confessed. Lady Winifred rose and embraced her brother, tears of relief shimmering in her eyes. My dear Edward, she whispered, welcome home at last. Miss Palmer joined in the embrace, while Mrs. Blake offered her quivering thanks. Julian Ward stepped forward, extending his hand to Edward with solemn respect. I look forward to rebuilding our partnership, he said. Edward clasped his hand, their mutual trust renewed. Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He surveyed the room, now suffused with the warm colors of recovery and redemption. Miss Amis, he said, raising an imaginary toast, let us remember that in the smallest of details lie the seeds of truth. It is by the unity of these details, the little grey cells, as I say, that one untangles the most tangled of mysteries. The household broke into murmurs of agreement, their spirits lifted at last from fear to hope. Outside, the autumn leaves danced in a gentle breeze, carrying away the shadows that had hovered over Grosvenor House. In the restored calm, Poirot quietly withdrew to the library's alcove, where a cup of tea awaited him, and allowed himself a moment of repose, his mission complete, his reputation secure, and justice served with elegance and precision. Thus, the mystery of the regretful note reached its just conclusion, a testament to the power of observation, the courage of the innocent, and the unerring brilliance of Hercule Poirot.